The inevitable clash of church tech and climate science, July 28th, 2023. It's a joke we ought to take a little more seriously. There's a single panel cartoon making the theological Twitter rounds, or X as it were now, I guess, that warrants a bit more thought than most Saturday morning paper comics. Not the ones in my demographic actually read, but mostly because we have Reddit and Substack now. Essentially, it points out a very real and timely correlation, one that points to false gods of the world demanding human lives for the apparent control over the weather. Be it good weather for crops or reliable weather for war campaigns, deities of all sorts were all on the same page and demanded human death and loss of life and human flourishing for the alleged control of the climate. Thankfully, the Bible has something to say about the demands about anything claiming to be a god that isn't nailed to a cross on our behalf. But I say that the things that which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice unto devils, and not unto God, and I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. 1 Corinthians 10:20, King James Version. I want to point out that it's not that there's an obvious hallmark of demonic activity in the climate science community. It's just that the only other group that has ever sought to control something as massive and complicated as the climate, or weather, has been demons masquerading as gods. Our infallible collection of holy texts tells us so. You know, the Bible. If you don't believe the Bible is to be that kind of infallible, then I can't fathom a reason for you to worry about the demons mentioned above, though I do wonder how you reconcile the necessary mastery of the weather that our authorities need to have to insist that their tax-funded program that will reverse what we have thus far ignorantly caused, so far as climate change goes. This is another great example of the concept of consilience, a word that I'm finding uses for far too often for it to be more coincidence instead. What we learned during the last phone-enabled human tracking experience. Where does this connect to church tech exactly? Through the Wi-Fi and 5G data plans, of course. Something accepted via ignorance or attrition the last time this kind of control was assumed to be possible by our authorities. Only instead of taxing us for carbon, they just leveraged the tax on our descendants for relief programs by borrowing against the national debt. A few years back, our smartphones were used to make sure something infinitesimally smaller than the Earth's climate would be managed, a virus, by some of the most authoritarian means and measures seen to date. You couldn't get toilet paper without proper paperwork in hand, but since another part of the climate change behemoth is going paperless, guess where that paperwork was kept? On our phones. Those same phones gave authorities all they needed to insist on how our churches opened and closed, because through them and the barely supported idea of online church, it was at very least a possibility. It became an, if not the, argument against those with proper liturgies and doctrine on how to close the door and limit their numbers at the demand of authorities. It also became a whip from those that did light the incense to Caesar to urge civilly disobedient brethren to comply with Romans chapter 13. You can go to church online, was the argument, but in fact no arguing or theological debate was ever done to establish if we could do so. It just looked like we could go to church online, so we all agreed, in ignorance or attrition. Without the internet, or as most people experience their use of the internet, the smartphone, the online church was not a possibility. We could not have accepted the terms of years without regular gatherings for church if it meant our communications were bound to paper and ink and the postal service. But since it was convenient, we took 4K stream services to the chin and said thank you to the small g deity that gave it to us, though it likely wasn't the one we claimed to worship. Those phones will be the only feasible way for any organization, government or otherwise, to feign an attempt at controlling the weather, because it's through those phones that they will establish control over the populace instead, the same way they did it before. Only instead of an invisible bug, we will have a super visible climate that in fact is always changing in the first place. There are valid reasons to distrust pagans with white clothing. And you'll notice the term I use to describe the next crisis du jour isn't the more familiar global warming. Sometime in the familiar past, that term was ditched, likely when the ice caps did not in fact flood the Earth like Al Gore promised, or when the polar bear population grew instead of shrank. I could give you a list of internet-based research to show my position, but it won't matter because we've officially got to the part of the story where you think I'm a conspiracy theorist, not just a guy who knows Baal worship when I see it. Instead, I'm going to give you a quick Twitter, or X now I guess, thread to read so that you can show you how climate change is not, at least possibly, what it seems to be. Found here. It's 15 tweets long and one of the best explanations of what's going on, the weird pivot to climate change science mania. We are seeing this in close to the end of a global pandemic. That isn't technically over. The best parts, what I'll build my case on, are tweets 5 through 8. They show, in essence, that you can, in fact, say truthful things for dishonest reasons. And if we only had a biblical example of that kind of behavior as well. And now the serpent was more subtle than any other beast of the field which the Lord God had made. Genesis 3:1, King James Version. And saith unto him, If thou shalt be the Son of God, cast thyself down, for it is written, He shall give his angels charge concerning thee, and in thy hands they shall bear thee up, lest thee dash thy foot against a stone. Matthew 4:6, King James Version. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. 2 Corinthians 11:13-15, King James Version. If you're paying attention, we now have two different kinds of things lined up like they were drawn on both sides of a ruler. Demon-led cults with scientists wanting to control the weather, and people saying one thing but loading the words with ill intent towards mankind for another. They make a very grim match set if they do in fact go hand in raised worshipful hand together. So far, I only have 2 nickels for every time I notice something fishy. How many coins are going to be in this tribute fish when I finally fetch it for Jesus? And will we have saved the whales by then? The necessity of smartphones of a smartphone culture for Christians who cuss sometimes and online pastors. Because of the climate lockdowns, we need smartphones for the faithful to be inseparable from their hands and foreheads, looking at you, Vision Pro types, even more closely. It's far past the time we start looking at how these technologies are affecting the church, not just the kind and quality of wool pulled over our eyes, but in the kinds of wool that belongs to sheep, not goats, regardless of how cashmere the texture of wool might be. We do not have a broad and widely accepted theology of the internet. But those who would close the church doors do, and they're not Christians. They use it for utility and for entertainment, and blur that line like it's the word husband in 1 Timothy 3:2. We have Instagram accounts of sneakers and brethren who cuss sometime, of every and any sort of niche to derive an audience from. Twitter accounts that you can fight from any corner of the theological rim and still have backup, and enough pastors on Gab and Truth Social to make David French's fingers sore on any given Saturday night. And all this is more to simply there. And all of this and more is simply there, using the same tools and data collection big tech hoards while reaping none of the data collected. This online world of the Christian faith only exists because Christians think and believe, and now such practice that you can have your faith online, blissfully unaware that what that entails and what other faiths show up to the practice and worship too. The small g gods of climate change ideology are worshiping at the same high places we flock to in this online landscape. So, when push comes to shove, the church will be asked to change so that the climate doesn't, even if the climate isn't changing, just like the weather that never obeyed Baal but came to heal at Jesus' beckoning. Their followers are willing to superglue their hands to the pavement and destroy priceless artwork for their cause. What are ours known for doing in the face of similar, if not worse, existential crises? Someone check with the JMac and Coates. We may need a refresher. The glut of data we are giving to the scientists now, that will be unable to ungive to them later. On one hand, we are feeding an information-consuming state all the information it needs to warrant a public shutdown of the modern evangelical church, especially the megachurch model. When carbon trackers register 1,000 cars all pulling up to one of the largest air-conditioned buildings in the city, will we be as exempt from the rolling blackouts as our tax status says? We don't bring in tax dollars like professional sports or Walmart. We actually take money back from the government because of our tax receipts, and they won't forget that when it comes time to offer the grants to the altar of peer review. Did we have the requisite reasoning to say that the church was essential when we agreed in 96% unity, according to Barna, that the church can simply meet online, even when it can't? Will 96% of us be okay with foregoing an in-person gathering for the sake of Mother Earth? Or maybe we need something meatier for this sacrifice on our side. Does an earth that is destined for fire and renewal need to be saved from change? Or by Jesus? What do we do when the authorities shut down your church for being north of net zero carbon? Quite simple, really. Stay open this time.